Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals on Gran Turismo Sport. And of course we haven't featured this series in a few weeks, but we are returning with a bang, the first one of the year, with a very heated showdown, and a very obvious one as well. The pinnacle of Ferrari going against the, in effect, former pinnacle of Ferrari, at least as far as road cars go, the iconic Enzo versus the Ferrari, the LaFerrari. Now, of course, these cars are in the exact same lineage. They occupy the exact same space in the Ferrari tree, that being the top-tier supercar of their selection, or some could say hypercar in some cases. In fact, the Enzo back in the day was one of the first vehicles to be called a hypercar. There were probably a couple before that, but it was the first one that started to make that name a trend among the exotic car world. Now, both of these borrow very heavily from Formula One tech. They're both about as advanced as they can be for their respective time, but it will be interesting to see how they compare, considering how quickly technology, especially motoring technology, accelerates. So, as always, we'll break down either car on its own, some good points, bad points, highlights, and then put them in a direct head-on battle to find out, purely for the fun of it, of course, which is the whole point of this series, which one is better as far as points go. First up then we have the old guard, if you will, the Ferrari Enzo, and for those who are perhaps wondering why I'm not also including the F40, because that in effect represents a similar kind of jump in technology between that and the Enzo, and that was also this kind of car back then, well, the reason why is because I'm hoping that they will add the F50 at some point. I don't have any insider information there, but it just didn't seem appropriate to feature the F40 with these two, given how much more advanced they are. The outcome is obvious. Of course, the F40 is going to lose. However, if they do add the F50 to the game, then you can guarantee I will feature an ultimate Ferrari battle between all four of those flagship models. But that's for the future. For now, the Enzo is, of course, the old guard, as I said, as far as their modern supercars or hypercars go, but at the same time, ironically, it's actually newer to the game. It's not newer to the franchise, but it is newer to GT Sport, because we got it in the most recent DLC. And it was one of the coolest cars in the pack, certainly one of the fastest, and I believe the most powerful car in the pack. Now, it costs 1 million credits, which is the same as on Gran Turismo 6, and in its peak tune, it's got almost 700 pound-feet of torque, just over 900 horsepower, not quite as much actually as on GT6. The weight is just over 1100 kilos, which is roughly the kind of weight of a race car, like a GT class machine, say a GT1 model for instance. And the horsepower per tonne is well over 800 in fully tuned form. Now, on a slight side note, and this is something which I'm actually going to touch on even more so in this week's Beards and Cars on Saturday, this is an occasion where, once again, we are featuring the cars in fully tuned form. And I know some people do wonder, why do I do that? Surely it would be better to compare the cars in their stock form. Well, no, because this series isn't about comparing the cars in stock form. It's as simple as that. It's about having fun and seeing what the car's upper potential is and comparing them in their absolute ultimate form. So with that in mind, that's why they're fully tuned. It really is as simple as that. Now, the Enzo, for those who maybe haven't bought it or won it yet, has a very good range of use. At least potentially. It can range right down from N600 all the way up to N900. So it's got 4 separate classes where you can use it. That's pretty good. For a supercar, that's pretty strong, and especially in the lower end, say N600, it becomes easier to drive, but also very effective. It's a very, very fast car. However, the Enzo is not an easy car to drive at all, and it's quite interesting to notice that despite being about as advanced a road car as you could get when it was released, the difference now between driving the Enzo and the LaFerrari is notable. I drove the Enzo first and then the LaFerrari in this test, and the feeling difference between the two is remarkable. They feel like decades apart. The Enzo feels great still, but it feels primitive compared to the LaFerrari, which is amazing because when it was released, it was cutting edge, and if you compare it to an F50 or an F40, it feels the same again. Overall though, definitely not a beginner's car. You could try it if you want to, but it demands respect, really, especially in fully tuned form with 900 horsepower on sports tyres. But if you do pilot it well, it can certainly give you great times on certain tracks, and can easily rival stuff like the Veyron or the Veneno. What then about the LaFerrari? Well, the LaFerrari, of course, is one of the highlights of GT Sport on day one. It was one of those cars which many people, understandably, myself included, wanted to get their hands on as quickly as possible. Like the Veneno and the Aston Martin Vulcan, it's a significant new exotic to have in the game. But unlike some, I'm looking at you, Veneno, this one doesn't disappoint. The LaFerrari is incredibly capable and very quick. It's already got around 1,000 horsepower. In peak form, you're looking around 1,030, it's 1,036 to be exact. The weight is lower than the Enzo, and consequently, of course, the horsepower per ton is also higher. In fact, this one actually has nearly 1,000 horsepower per ton in its peak tune. That's pretty impressive, and incidentally, because of that, it actually spans more classes, N600 up to N1000, so it has one whole class higher than the Enzo in terms of its use, and the N1000 category is a very significant one when you're going up against the kind of cars at that level, like Enzo's for instance, so this is a very good one to bear in mind. Now, as always, the lap time isn't awarded a point, and of course we'll come back to that in a second, but it was interesting to note that the LaFerrari wasn't just quicker, for me at least, it was a lot quicker. Now the Enzo is a slippery car, and so is the LaFerrari, but the LaFerrari did surprise me by just how much quicker it was. In the Enzo I did a 147.8, in the LaFerrari a 144.5. That's a huge difference between the two cars, especially on a track which takes well under 2 minutes to do. So, of course, there'd be different results for different people there, but I did find that surprising just how much quicker the LaFerrari was, and around the Nordschleife, it's an incredibly fast machine. Even detuned, in fact, to say N700 or N800, it's still Group 3 race car quick, and for a road car, that's very impressive. One of the biggest differences that you can feel between the LaFerrari and the Enzo is the advancements and improvements in aerodynamics. The Enzo feels like it's very much chiseled out of marble, if you will. It is what it is, the aero is what it is, it's got an air brake, but that's about it. It's designed to be a very aerodynamically efficient car for its time, but that's it. The LaFerrari feels almost like you're driving, in essence, a car that has a liquid body, because it has that active aero working all the time. It's not as noticeable as something like a Huayra, but it's working. It's doing its job, and it's doing it very well. And you can definitely feel that in the LaFerrari. It gives you so much more control, despite being lighter and far more powerful, and that's a testament to the tech on the car. A lot of people find both of these very challenging, and of course I can understand why. They are very slippery, but at the same time they can both give you some serious lap times. So what then about the points? Well, let's find out. First of all then, as usual, we have, of course, the price, and interestingly, but again not too surprisingly, the Enzo does edge out the LaFerrari here, although, funnily enough, in real life I believe the Enzo can actually be more expensive than the LaFerrari to buy because of how coveted it is, especially if you get one that isn't red. But on the game, it's 1 million credits to the 1.6 million of the LaFerrari. So in perspective, that means the Enzo is the same as it was on Gran Turismo 6, which is a basic supercar price, that's Zonda territory, for instance, whereas the LaFerrari is 1.6 million, which is more like an LMP car on Gran Turismo 6. So an interesting comparison, but also an appropriate one, I would say. As far as engine size, well, as we always say, of course, biggest is not automatically best, but we do these as a top trump style just for fun breakdown. So for the sake of that, we will say that biggest is best, so of course, the LaFerrari wins. Not by a huge amount, 6 litre to a 6.3, but it's still enough to give it the victory. As far as class range, well, of course, I already mentioned that the LaFerrari does get that point as well, because both of them can be detuned to a respectable N600, which I would strongly recommend looking into. It makes them very usable, but at the same time, the LaFerrari can go higher, and the fact that it can go higher isn't why it's getting the point. it's purely because that's more classes. If it was one class lower, it would still get the point, because it has that much extra usability. As far as power goes, well, I already mentioned, it's the more powerful car. The LaFerrari has over 1,000 horsepower, and the Enzo has less than it already had on Gran Turismo 6. If memory serves, I believe it had somewhere around 980, I think it might have even been 979, so the Enzo has never quite been 1,000 horsepower on the Gran Turismo, or in the Gran Turismo franchise, so the LaFerrari is quite simply more powerful. As far as torque though, very interestingly, the Enzo is better, and by a lot. It's got well over 100 pound-feet of torque more at 688 pound-feet to the 573 on the LaFerrari. That's very impressive indeed, and of course for the Enzo, it's a very important point for it to claw back. As far as weight though, we go right back to the usual with, of course, the LaFerrari getting the point. Again, it is the lighter of the two. Again, they're fairly similar, just under 1100, just over 1100, but it's enough to give the LaFerrari a point. And as far as horsepower per tonne, we already covered it. The Enzo's got just over 800, very respectable 838, which, don't get me wrong, that's massive. 838 horsepower per tonne is nothing to be sniffed at. That's literally LMP car territory. But 960 on the LaFerrari is quite simply so much higher. It's one of the highest power to weight ratios in the game, especially for a road car. So overall, that means that as far as the sheer points go, lap times as always notwithstanding, the LaFerrari is the winner with 5 points to the Enzo's 2. And interestingly, this is one of the very few occasions where the car's points are actually exclusive. Each car's points are just for that car, because quite often we'll have two cars which will have equal points or equal stats in a certain way. That's not the case here. Each car's points are totally its own, and as a quick rundown, the Enzo is cheaper and has more torque, both of which are pretty decent advantages, whereas the LaFerrari, of course, has the larger engine, which, give or take for importance there, but it can span more classes, it has more power, it's lighter, and has more horsepower per tonne. And of course, the 147 lap compared to a 144. So, a pretty big difference in terms of lap times, and once again, we don't see that happen that often, that the car which wins on paper and points is also the quicker of the two. But again, not too surprisingly, it is the LaFerrari with the win overall, and it definitely is the better car if you're talking pure supercars or hypercars. But both are worth checking out, so by all means, if you do get the chance to drive the Enzo and the LaFerrari on GT Sport, yeah, take the opportunity. They are good supercars, good hypercars, but don't expect them to be as forgiving as something like a GTR, of course not. Overall then, that's it for this Rivals match. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.